Following the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, the United States started gearing up for war. The United States reinstituted a draft and began mobilizing. And in March of 1965, Johnson had sent American troops to Vietnam.
There are several famous battles associated with the Vietnam War. First is the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964. Second, the Tet Offensive in 1968, the Battle of Saigon in 1968, Khe Sanh in 1968, and Hamburger Hill in 1969. In 1965, President Lyndon Johnson is compelled to send 180,000 U.S. troops to fight in Vietnam. LBJ had promised in the 1964 presidential campaign that he would not send U.S. troops into Vietnam. However, with the threat of South Vietnam falling to the communists, and with 61% of Americans supporting military intervention, LBJ violates his own campaign promise and his own conscience, and sends troops into harm's way. The U.S. commander in Vietnam, General William Westmoreland, asked President Johnson for more troops. He believed that the South Vietnamese couldn't withstand the Vietcong assault without U.S. support. They were too weak and needed extra help. He also believed that the Vietcong would be overwhelmed with more U.S. ground troops and superior weaponry. All President Johnson had to do was double down on the amount of troops he was sending, and the Vietnam conflict could be won. Hoping for a quick victory, President Johnson complied and instituted a draft.
I have asked the commanding general, General Westmoreland, what more he needs to meet this mounting aggression. He has told me, and we will meet his needs.
By 1967, over 500,000 U.S. troops were on the ground in South Vietnam. However, at home, the draft was incredibly unpopular, particularly among young people.
But the presence of so many U.S. forces did not result in an easy victory. Very quickly, the Vietnam War became a war of attrition, meaning the war became a stalemate and each side was trying to hold on. A determined Vietcong used guerrilla warfare and the terrain to their advantage. The Vietcong were pro-communist fighters who supported Ho Chi Minh, but they lived in South Vietnam. Vietcong military tactics would inflict massive casualties on U.S. troops. The Vietcong employed these guerrilla warfare and hit-and-run tactics. They used the thick jungle to ambush U.S. troops. Once they ambushed, they would run away, and this made it hard to hit them back. Vietcong forces lived within the population of South Vietnam, making it hard to distinguish who was who. On the battlefield, the Vietcong dug intricate defense tunnel systems. These tunnels allowed the Vietcong forces to withstand airstrikes and launch surprise attacks. These tunnels also connected villages and allowed guerrilla fighters to hide from U.S. forces and set booby traps for U.S. forces coming through villages and inspecting these tunnels. One tactic the Vietcong used was to disarm or reuse United States landmines and bombs and create booby traps out of them. They would have children carry bales of hay and hide grenades within them. When soldiers came by, these grenades would go off, killing them and the child. The Vietcong used so many landmines, U.S. troops were forced to sweep the land before they could walk by it. They used metal detectors in an attempt to detect these mines. One of the scariest booby traps was called a Punji Pit. This Punji Pit, where the Vietcong would place wooden stakes that were sharpened into spears, and if a U.S. soldier fell into it, they would be impaled. These booby traps were on the minds of U.S. soldiers. Not only did they have to worry about being shot at, they had to be on a constant lookout for hidden mechanisms of death.
By 1966, it became clear that the United States had underestimated the Vietcong. General Westmoreland thought that the Vietcong would surrender if they were hit hard enough over a long period of time. To him, the solution was simply to increase U.S. ground forces and escalate airstrikes against the Vietcong. However, the Vietcong saw this war as a fight for survival and remained defiant. In their eyes, their strategy would be to hide from American airstrikes as to minimize their casualties, and then patiently set ambushes and traps to inflict casualties on American forces. General Westmoreland's strategy of attrition, or waiting out the enemy until they finally surrender, began to backfire, and morale among U.S. troops sunk, and growing casualty numbers eroded their will to fight.
The United States began their offensive campaign with what was known as Operation Rolling Thunder. This is where the United States initiated a massive bombing campaign of North Vietnam. This was to weaken the North Vietnamese forces before the United States sent their troops up north. Between 1965 and 1968, U.S. forces waged the most intense air and ground battle of the Cold War. Over 800,000 tons of bombs are dropped on Vietcong targets, more than all of the Korean War combined. For 3 years, U.S. airstrikes and carpet bombings hit Vietcong bases and convoys. The airstrikes were accompanied by ground assaults into enemy villages and defenses. Operation Rolling Thunder had 4 main goals. First was to boost the United States morale and public opinion at home. The Vietnam War was very unpopular at home because American citizens didn't understand why we were involved in a country that many Americans had never even heard of. Second was to end South Vietnamese civilian support for the Vietcong. Even in the South, there were pro-communist supporters because Ho Chi Minh was a very popular leader. He was a man of the people, and his leadership seemed to be gaining support in the South. Third, the United States wanted to destroy Vietcong industrial bases and supply roads. And fourth, the United States wanted to cut off Vietcong supply lines to the south. Their goal was to starve out the Vietcong so they could no longer continue their fight.
If the US was going to win the war, they needed to eliminate the effectiveness of the Vietcong guerrilla warfare. To eliminate the advantage of terrain in which the Vietcong would hide, US forces employed a defoliation assault. They used herbicides and chemicals to destroy jungle cover and expose enemy positions, and then kill the Vietcong hiding there. The United States used 2 devastating chemicals from the air in order to wipe out jungles: Agent Orange and napalm. By 1971, 20 million gallons of poisons were sprayed from the air on the countries of South Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. These chemicals were extremely potent and deadly, killing thousands of civilians and giving cancer to U.S. veterans who returned from the front. Once the jungle cover was destroyed, the next phase saw U.S. forces use search and destroy tactics. Villages were raided and searched for supplies and hiding Vietcong troops. Homes and crops were burnt, livestock was killed, and civilians were murdered. The Vietnam War had turned brutal.
On January 30th of 1968, on the Vietnamese Lunar New Year, the Vietcong launched a surprise attack on U.S. forces. Using the Ho Chi Minh Trail, tens of thousands of Viet Cong snuck into the south and attacked cities and United States bases. This was a violation of a week-long truce called to celebrate the holiday, and the Viet Cong used this as cover. 12 U.S. bases and the U.S. Embassy were attacked, and there were 3,000 U.S. casualties during the offensive. It took a month for the United States and South Vietnamese forces to drive the Viet Cong out, resulting in 32,000 North Vietnamese troops losing their lives. While this was technically a military victory for the United States, it was a devastating psychological defeat for the United States.
After the Tet Offensive, the Vietnam War would never be the same. The surprise Viet Cong attack over the Lunar New Year exposed a growing credibility gap in President Johnson's White House. The president had insisted that the Viet Cong were near surrender, but if that were true, how could they stage this massive offensive against U.S. troops? Most Americans believed that Johnson had lied about the war. After Tet, American public opinion for Johnson and the war began to plummet. Moderates and war hawks in Congress who had supported the war strongly turned into peace ducks and called for an immediate withdrawal of U.S. troops. Most Americans at home were torn between the choice of staying in the war at the threat of greater U.S. casualties or withdrawing from the conflict and risking dishonor on the country. The media began to criticize the war as well, bringing home the facts of what was happening on the front. Every nightly newscast began with a body count of how many casualties had been inflicted on U.S. troops that day in Vietnam, and images of coffins draped in American flags were broadcast into American homes. Even the most famous broadcaster in American history, Walter Cronkite, began to support the option of withdrawal and negotiation.
On the off chance the military and political analysts are right, in the next few months we must test the enemy's intentions in case this is indeed his last big gasp before negotiations. But it is increasingly clear to this reporter that the only rational way out then will be to negotiate, not as victors, but as an honorable people who lived up to their pledge to defend democracy and did the best they could. This is Walter Cronkite. Good night.
President Johnson said when learning about this, "If I've lost Walter Cronkite, then it's over. I've lost Mr. Average Citizen." The Vietnam War is a defining moment in American history. It splinters American society at home, causing radical groups to fight against each other. The ripples of this fight are still felt in American society today. It physically and psychologically affects the U.S. military and the veterans who fought in Vietnam. And it came to define the presidency of Lyndon Baines Johnson. Hoping his presidency would be defined by his great society, Johnson would have to focus his entire attention on the war and how to end it. And it would lead him to make a decision in 1968 that no one expected. Ask anyone your parents' age, and they will tell you that the Vietnam War is an event that defined a moment in their lives. And the divisions from that war have a lasting impact in America today.